In a small town divided by race and power, routine traffic stop turns into a life-altering encounter. Detective Kyle Prescott, hardened by years on the police force, assaults David Langston, an outspoken community activist, sparking a racially charged scandal. But as their bitter conflict escalates, an earth-shattering truth emerges. Kyle and David are brothers, separated by a tragic past neither of them knew existed. As an investigation unravels decades of lies, Kyle is forced to confront the dark secrets of his upbringing, while David grapples with the discovery of a long-lost sibling who has become his enemy. Together, they uncover a conspiracy that stretches deep into the town's history, a legacy of corruption, racism, and murder that claimed the life of their mother and tore them apart. Now, they must decide whether they will fight together to bring the truth to light or let the past destroy them both. Bloodlines of Broken Truths is a powerful, emotional tale of family, redemption, and the battle for justice in a broken system. Bloodlines of Broken Truths is a gripping and emotionally charged novel that confronts the deepest divides of race, family, and justice. Detective Kyle Prescott has built his life around the law, but when a routine traffic stop turns violent, he finds himself at the center of a racially charged scandal. The man he assaulted, David Langston, is determined to hold Kyle accountable for what seems like another case of police brutality, until a shocking revelation changes everything. Kyle and David are brothers, separated by a tragic past and kept apart by a web of lies. As the town reels from the aftermath of their violent encounter, an investigation into the elderly woman who raised Kyle unearths a dark secret. Their mother didn't just abandon them. She was silenced, part of a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of local power. A truth Kyle never wanted to know, and one David has spent his life fighting against. Torn between the brother he wronged and the system he thought he could trust, Kyle must confront the painful truths of his past. For David, the discovery of his long-lost sibling is both a revelation and a betrayal. As they struggle to reconcile their identities, the brothers uncover a legacy of corruption, racism, and murder that stretches back decades and threatens to destroy them both. In this dramatic and powerful tale, Bloodlines of Broken Truths explores the bonds of family, the complexities of identity, and the choices we make in the pursuit of justice. Can two men on opposite sides of the law find redemption in the truth, or will their shared bloodline be the final casualty of a broken system? A story of forgiveness, sacrifice, and hope, Bloodlines of Broken Truths will leave you breathless until the very last page. Kyle Prescott, a stocky white man in his 40s with graying brown hair and a strong jaw. His face is weathered by years on the force, with deep blue eyes that hint at hidden emotional turmoil. He carries himself with an air of authority, his tall, muscular frame always rigid. Raised by an elderly woman who hid the truth of his origins, Kyle grew up with a rigid, authoritarian mindset that shaped his approach to law enforcement. He rose through the ranks of the police department with a reputation for being tough but fair, at least in his own eyes. Unbeknownst to him, the woman who raised him was hiding dark secrets about his past, and his racist tendencies stem from years of being fed subtle bigotry and misinformation. David Langston, a black man in his 40s with a lean, athletic build and short hair. His brown eyes are intense and full of passion, and his face bears the wear and tear of years of struggle. His posture is confident, his movements purposeful, reflecting the strength he has found in hardship. David grew up in foster care, never knowing his real family. He became an outspoken community organizer, advocating for racial equality and justice after experiencing systemic racism firsthand. Fiercely committed to his cause, David has built a life around confronting injustice, but he is haunted by the unknowns of his childhood and the family he never knew. Martha Prescott, elderly woman, a frail woman in her late 80s, with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her piercing eyes and striking features suggest a once imposing presence, though age has taken its toll. Her voice is soft but carries a weight of authority. Martha was once a socialite in the upper echelons of the city, but her connections to local elites led her into a dark conspiracy that destroyed Kyle and David's lives. Driven by guilt and her own prejudices, she orchestrated the separation of the brothers and covered up the truth about their heritage. Martha now lives in isolation, haunted by the consequences of her actions, which are slowly unraveled as the story unfolds. Catherine Langston, mother, a striking black woman in her 20s at the time of her death, with a slender build and soulful eyes. She wore her natural curls proudly, with a warm, welcoming smile that belied the hardships she faced. Catherine was a whistleblower and a mother determined to protect her two young sons. She was silenced when she came too close to exposing a network of corruption within the local government and police force. After her death, her sons were separated. Kyle was adopted by Martha and David was left in the foster care system. Her story is central to uncovering the conspiracy that tore the brothers apart. The small-town police department, a two-story brick building that looks imposing from the outside but is worn down on the inside. The walls are lined with old plaques and faded photos of former officers. Inside, the atmosphere is tense, with worn furniture and a stark contrast between the older, hardened officers and the new recruits trying to push for change. It's a symbol of an old, failed system. Description of David's Community Center. A repurposed building in a struggling neighborhood, the center is a haven for those seeking refuge from systemic injustices. Though modest, it's a lively space, filled with books, protest signs, and community art, and often bustling with activity. The peeling paint and cracked floors reflect the harsh realities of the community, but the energy inside is resilient and hopeful. Martha's house. A grand old Victorian home on the outskirts of town, its grandeur has faded over the years. The paint is chipped, the garden is overgrown, and the interior is filled with old furniture and dusty relics of the past. The house holds many secrets, and its eerie stillness reflects the suppressed truths that haunt Martha's past. The forested outskirts, dense, shadowy woods on the edge of town where Catherine Langston's car was found wrecked decades ago. The area is secluded, with tall trees casting long shadows. It's the perfect place for secrets to be buried, both literally and figuratively. This setting is where the final truths about Catherine's death and the larger conspiracy are revealed. Uncovering the past, the investigation deepens, taking the investigation further and deepening the mystery surrounding Kyle's past. Police Department, conference room. Investigators continue interviewing witnesses. They find inconsistencies in Kyle's records, including adoption papers and a suspicious gap in his childhood. Kyle is interviewed privately and shown his file. His confusion deepens when details about his biological parents are brought to light, something he was never told. The investigation forces Kyle to confront his past, which he has always avoided. Kyle becomes desperate to understand who he really is and what his connection to David is. Cliffhanger. Kyle is asked to take a leave of absence from the police, fueling his desperation to clear his name. David begins his own search, showing David's determination to uncover the truth about Kyle and the larger conspiracy. Setting: David's Community Center. David speaks to his lawyer about the strange phone call. His lawyer dismisses it, but David begins to suspect that there is more to Kyle's past than anyone knows. He begins investigating local records, uncovering news stories about missing children and systemic racism within the police department that go back decades. David's search is fueled by the strange call and his need to understand why anyone would suggest a hidden truth. David learns of the corruption that has existed in the city for years, realizing that this case is part of a much larger pattern. Cliffhanger. David discovers a photo of Martha Prescott from years ago, connected to several powerful figures in the city, and begins to wonder if she holds the key to everything. Kyle confronts Martha, bringing Kyle closer to discovering the truth about his family and creating a moment of reckoning. Martha's house. Kyle, on leave and desperate for answers, visits Martha. He confronts her about her adoption and the gaps in her past. Martha is initially evasive, but Kyle's anger and persistence finally break her. She reveals that Kyle was adopted under unusual circumstances, but refuses to say more. Kyle's growing desperation leads him to press Martha to find out the truth. Martha breaks down and suggests that Kyle and David are connected by more than their recent encounter. Cliffhanger. A shaken Kyle leaves with more questions than answers, but Martha whispers, "You and David share more than blood." The discovery, the DNA test, providing definitive proof of Kyle and David's family connection. Kyle's house. Kyle, paranoid and overwhelmed, takes a DNA test after his conversation with Martha. He anxiously awaits the results, rehashing every strange detail about his childhood. Kyle needs confirmation of what he is beginning to suspect, his connection to David. Backlash. The DNA test results reveal that Kyle and David are in fact brothers, leaving Kyle stunned and guilty. Cliffhanger. Kyle realizes that he assaulted his own brother, a revelation that shatters his self-image. David discovers the truth, revealing David's knowledge of the family connection and sending his character into emotional turmoil. David's house. David, continuing his search for Kyle's past, discovers documents that lead to the truth about their shared ancestry. He initially doesn't believe it, but then begins to piece it all together. David's relentless search for the truth reveals the one thing he never expected. Kyle is his brother. David is torn between his fight for justice and the emotional toll of discovering the brother he never knew. Hypertonic moment. David confronts his lawyer, saying, "I can't just destroy him, not when he's my blood." Martha's full confession provides critical backstory and introduces the conspiracy that keeps the brothers apart. Martha's house. Martha, feeling guilty after Kyle's visit, contacts David, requesting a meeting. She confesses the full story. Catherine Langston, her mother, was investigating corruption within the city's power structure, which led to her being targeted and killed. Martha, who was connected to the corrupt officials, took Kyle in to protect him, believing she was sparing him from harm, but ultimately contributing to their separation. Martha's years of guilt and fear that the truth will come out lead her to finally tell David everything. David realizes that his and Kyle's entire lives have been shaped by this secret, and the roots of their conflict go much deeper than personal animosity. Cliffhanger. Martha tells David, "Your mother died trying to protect you both from something very bad." The conspiracy unfolds. Kyle confronts corruption objective, to shift Kyle's arc toward redemption by exposing the corrupt system he unknowingly upheld. Kyle's police department, late at night. Kyle, now knowing the truth, returns to the station and begins investigating old records, connecting the dots between the conspiracy his mother uncovered and the people in power. Kyle's guilt over his role in perpetuating corruption drives him to seek redemption. He discovers documents that link his superiors to Catherine Langston's death, realizing he was working for the same people responsible for his mother's murder. Cliffhanger. Kyle is confronted by a high-ranking officer who warns him to stop digging or face the consequences. David's decision objective. To explore David's internal conflict over whether to seek justice or reconcile with Kyle. David's community center. David has a private meeting with his closest allies, explaining the full story of his and Kyle's connection. Some advise him to expose Kyle publicly, while others advocate forgiveness and a chance to heal. David's discovery of their shared past puts him in a difficult position: fight or forgive. David decides to confront Kyle, not as an enemy, but as a brother, to finally put the past to rest. Cliffhanger. David prepares to meet Kyle, unsure how their conversation will go or if reconciliation is possible. The showdown. The emotional climax in which the brothers confront each other and the truth. The wooded outskirts, near the site of their mother's death. David and Kyle meet at the site of their mother's death. Both men are tense, unsure of how to begin. Kyle confesses his guilt, not only for the assault, but for being part of the system that contributed to their separation and their mother's death. The brothers must come to terms with their shared trauma and the corruption they have uncovered. David expresses his anger, but also his understanding that they have both been manipulated by forces greater than themselves. Cliffhanger. Just as the two seem to find common ground, they are interrupted by police officers sent to silence them once and for all. The final fight goal. A dramatic, physical showdown with corrupt law enforcement. The forest. Action. A tense physical altercation erupts as Kyle and David are attacked by corrupt officers sent to eliminate them. The leaders of the conspiracy realize that Kyle and David know too much. The brothers work together to fight back, finally united against the true enemy. Cliffhanger. Kyle is injured, but the two manage to escape, taking with them the last evidence needed to bring down the conspiracy. Resolution. Scene 1. Exposing the truth. Kyle and David work together to expose the corruption and end their personal journey. A courtroom and city hall. Kyle and David present their findings to the media and the justice system. The corrupt officials are finally exposed, and a formal investigation begins. The evidence they have gathered implicates high-ranking officials in their mother's murder. The town is thrown into turmoil, but justice is finally served. Cliffhanger: Kyle and David stand together as the truth is revealed, uncertain of what the future holds, but finally free from the secrets that haunt them. The brothers' reconciliation provides emotional closure and hints at a new beginning for the brothers. David's community center. Kyle, recovering from his injuries, visits David at the community center. The two brothers speak candidly about their pasts and what the future holds. The events have forced them to reconsider their lives and their roles in each other's stories. The brothers reach a fragile but hopeful reconciliation. Kyle vows to spend the rest of his life trying to make things right, while David continues his fight for justice, this time with his brother by his side. Final note: as they leave the community center together, there is a sense of healing, though they both know the road ahead will be difficult. The evening sky bled into a muted orange as Kyle Prescott cruised down the quiet suburban street. His patrol car's engine hummed, a dull backdrop to his thoughts. Tensions had been mounting in town lately: community protests, media scrutiny, a general sense that the world was tipping out of control. He gripped the wheel tighter, jaw clenched. If there was one thing he believed in, it was order, and in his eyes, he was there to uphold it. His eyes caught the car speeding past, a black sedan cutting through the otherwise peaceful road. Kyle's hand instinctively reached for the radio, but he stopped short. He didn't need backup for something as simple as a traffic violation. The light bar atop his car flickered red and blue as he flipped the switch, signaling the sedan to pull over. The car slowed, coming to a stop by the curb. Kyle parked behind it, his boots crunching gravel as he stepped out. He approached the car, his hand resting casually on his holster, a habit more than a need. Through the windshield, he saw a man in his 40s, his fingers tapping anxiously on the steering wheel. Kyle leaned down, tapping the window with 2 fingers. "License and registration," he said, his tone authoritative but tired. The window rolled down, and the man turned his head toward Kyle. His deep brown eyes were steady, but there was something about his posture, defensive, wary. "Is there a reason you pulled me over, officer?" the man asked. His voice was calm, but there was a slight edge to it. "You were speeding." "License and registration," Kyle repeated, his patience thinning. He didn't have time for questions. The man sighed, reaching into the glove compartment slowly, his movements deliberate. "I'm David Langston," he said, handing over the documents. "I'm on my way to a community meeting." Kyle took the papers, glancing at them quickly. The name clicked faintly in his mind. He'd seen it before, in relation to the protests stirring in the city. He scanned the street, his unease growing. "This isn't the first time you've been pulled over, is it?" Kyle remarked, his eyes narrowing as he recalled the file. David shifted in his seat. "You and I both know why that is." Kyle's grip tightened around the papers. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You know exactly what it means," David shot back, his calm demeanor cracking just slightly. His eyes burned with an intensity that made Kyle bristle. Kyle stepped back from the window, feeling the familiar surge of anger rise in his chest. "Step out of the car." David stared at him for a moment, incredulous. "For speeding?" "Out of the car, now," Kyle snapped, his hand now fully gripping his holster. The air between them thickened. David hesitated, then unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out of the car. He stood tall, his lean frame radiating a quiet strength that unnerved Kyle. Kyle moved closer, eyes locked on David's face. "Turn around." Hands on the hood. David's nostrils flared as he turned, placing his hands on the hood of the sedan, his body tense. As Kyle patted him down, a crowd began to gather from the nearby houses, phones out, recording. The tension escalated, but Kyle couldn't back down now. His pulse quickened. He had to maintain control. "This is unnecessary," David said quietly, barely turning his head. Kyle ignored him, pressing him harder against the car. In one swift motion, David shifted, his body twisting as if to pull away. Kyle's frustration boiled over, and before he could think, his hand flew forward, striking David's side. The man grunted in pain, and Kyle grabbed him by the arm, shoving him onto the ground. The phones were recording. The crowd murmured in shock. But Kyle was past the point of caring. All that mattered was that the man beneath him had challenged his authority, and that was something Kyle couldn't tolerate. Hours later, Kyle sat in the hospital waiting room, his leg bouncing nervously as he tried to process what had happened. The adrenaline still coursed through him, his hands shaking faintly despite his best efforts to still them. David Langston had been taken into the emergency room, his side bruised and ribs likely fractured. Kyle's own cheek stung from where David had shoved back during the scuffle, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the growing weight of dread that settled in his chest. The door to the waiting room opened, and Chief Reynolds strode in, his face a mixture of frustration and disbelief. Kyle stood, attempting to steady his nerves. "Chief," Kyle began, but Reynolds cut him off with a raised hand. "What the hell happened out there, Kyle?" the chief demanded. "This is going viral. Half the neighborhood's posted that video online." Kyle swallowed hard. The guy resisted. "I was following procedure." "Procedure?" Reynolds barked. "You knocked him to the ground in front of a dozen people filming you. This isn't going away." Kyle's throat tightened. "I did what I had to do." The chief's gaze hardened. "You're on administrative leave, effective immediately. We need to get ahead of this, or you're done." As the chief walked away, Kyle slumped back into his chair. He could feel the weight of the world crashing down on him. This wasn't supposed to happen. He wasn't supposed to lose control. But now, everything he had built was at risk. The next day, Kyle sat across from two internal affairs investigators in the dimly lit conference room of the police station. The air was thick with tension, the kind that clung to the walls and seeped into his skin. "We've reviewed the footage," one of the investigators said, flipping through a thick file of reports and video stills. "You've got a history of complaints, racial bias, excessive force. Care to explain?" Kyle's jaw tightened. "I don't treat anyone differently. I just enforce the law." The investigator raised an eyebrow. "And this time?" "He resisted arrest," Kyle replied, his voice flat, defensive. "He was being difficult. You saw the footage. He challenged my authority." The second investigator, a woman with sharp eyes, leaned forward. "We've also been reviewing your personal file. There's a discrepancy in your background. Something about your childhood adoption records. You aware of this?" Kyle blinked. "What does that have to do with anything?" "It's relevant," the investigator said. "We're just trying to piece together the full story here." A cold sense of confusion washed over Kyle. His adoption had never been something he thought about. He had been raised by Martha, the woman who had given him everything, or so he believed. He had never asked questions. But now, those gaps in his memory, those missing years, they felt like cracks beginning to widen beneath his feet. "We'll be looking into this further," the woman continued. "For now, take the leave. We'll be in touch." Kyle stood abruptly, his mind spinning. The investigation was growing beyond just a routine disciplinary hearing. It was starting to feel personal. Across town, David Langston sat in his kitchen, his side still aching from the confrontation. He had spent years fighting against injustice, but this felt different. The anger, the hurt, the humiliation, they burned deeper than before. His lawyer, a wiry man named Marcus, sat across from him, a concerned look on his face. "Are you sure you want to press charges, David? This could get messy. Kyle Prescott isn't just some rookie. He's been on the force for years." David's eyes hardened. "I don't care. This needs to stop. It's not just about me. This is about everyone in this community who's been treated like this." Marcus sighed, flipping through his legal pad. "I'll file the complaint, but be prepared. It's going to be a battle." David nodded, his mind already racing ahead. He wasn't just going to fight back in court. He was going to dig deeper. Something about Kyle Prescott felt off, like there was more to the story than met the eye. Later that evening, as David prepared to close his laptop after hours of research, his phone buzzed. The number was unrecognizable, and when he answered, a low, cryptic voice on the other end simply said, "You don't know everything about Prescott. Look closer." The line went dead, leaving David with more questions than answers, but also a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting Kyle now. He was chasing the truth, whatever it might be. Kyle sat in his car in front of the police department, his thoughts a tangled mess. The administrative leave wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It felt like a noose tightening around his neck. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than just a disciplinary review. His name was being dragged through the mud, and his future, everything he'd worked for, was crumbling. Stepping out of the car, he made his way into the station, avoiding eye contact with the few officers milling about. The air inside was heavy, like the building itself was holding its breath. Kyle entered the conference room where two internal investigators were waiting for him. Their faces were unreadable, but Kyle could sense their suspicion from the moment he sat down. "We've been looking deeper into the events from the other night," one of the investigators began, flipping through a stack of papers. "There are a few inconsistencies that need clarification." Kyle leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Inconsistencies?" The investigator pushed a folder toward him, its contents spilling open. "Police reports, witness statements, a few photos. We've been reviewing your file, Kyle. There are gaps in your records, especially around your childhood and adoption. Do you know anything about this?" Kyle's heart skipped a beat. "My childhood? What does that have to do with the incident?" The second investigator, a woman with sharp features, chimed in. "Everything. Actually, we believe this case might have deeper connections. There are rumors swirling that your past isn't what it seems." Kyle's confusion morphed into a knot of frustration. "What are you trying to say?" The male investigator sat back, his gaze steady. "We're saying there's more to this than just the altercation with David Langston. Your past might be tangled up with some complicated history." Kyle's stomach churned. What complicated history? He'd always known he was adopted, but Martha never mentioned anything suspicious. He'd never questioned it, until now. As the investigators continued to press, Kyle remained silent. He wasn't ready to confront the strange gaps in his life just yet. But their words gnawed at him as he left the room, his thoughts clouded with doubt. Across town, David Langston sat at his desk in the community center, staring at the phone. The mysterious call from last night had replayed in his mind over and over. "You don't know everything about Prescott. Look closer." Those words echoed like a warning, a challenge to dig deeper into Kyle's past. David wasn't one to back down from a challenge. He pushed aside the case files in front of him and opened his laptop. If there was more to Kyle Prescott, David was going to find it. His fingers flew over the keyboard as he searched for public records, newspaper clippings, anything that could give him insight into Kyle's history. At first, it was the usual: police accolades, mentions of minor incidents. But as he dug deeper into older records, something odd caught his attention. There were discrepancies in Kyle's early life, adoption papers that didn't quite add up, years that seemed to be missing from the narrative. David's brow furrowed. Something wasn't right. He began sifting through old news archives, and that's when he found it: a mention of an elderly woman, Martha Prescott, connected to several influential figures in the town's history. The article was from years ago, but it piqued David's curiosity. Why was this woman, Kyle's supposed adoptive mother, linked to powerful people in the city? And why did it feel like she was part of something bigger? As David leaned back in his chair, he realized this wasn't just about the incident anymore. This was about uncovering a truth that had been buried for decades. Kyle sat in his truck, parked outside Martha's house. The grand old Victorian home loomed in front of him, its once majestic exterior now faded and worn. The garden was overgrown, the paint peeling off the sides. It had been years since Kyle had really looked at the house, and now it seemed like a reflection of the secrets it was hiding. He took a deep breath and stepped out of the truck, walking up the steps to the front door. The air was thick with tension, as if the house itself was waiting for this moment. He knocked, his heart pounding in his chest. After a few moments, the door creaked open, revealing Martha. Her frail frame seemed even smaller than he remembered, but her eyes were sharp, piercing through him. "Kyle," she said softly, stepping aside to let him in. He entered the house, his gaze drifting over the dusty furniture, the old photographs on the walls. Memories of his childhood flooded back, but now they were tainted by the questions swirling in his mind. Martha, we need to talk, Kyle said, his voice strained. Martha nodded slowly, her face tight with worry. I've been expecting this. Kyle blinked, taken aback. Expecting what? What's going on? She led him to the living room, where they sat in silence for a few moments. Martha's hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap. There are things you don't know about your past, Kyle. Things I should have told you a long time ago. Kyle's pulse quickened. What do you mean? Martha looked down, her voice barely a whisper. Your adoption wasn't as simple as I made it seem. There were circumstances. Your mother, your real mother, she was involved in something dangerous. She was silenced. Kyle felt the ground shift beneath him. Silenced? What are you talking about? Martha's eyes filled with tears. She was trying to expose corruption in this town, powerful people who didn't want the truth to come out. They killed her, Kyle. And I took you in to protect you. Kyle's mind reeled. His entire life had been a lie, built on secrets and buried truths. Why didn't you tell me? Martha's voice cracked. I was trying to protect you. But now, I think you and David are connected by more than just that incident. Kyle froze. David Langston? Martha nodded. He's your brother. David stared at the grainy photograph in front of him. It was old, faded, but the faces were unmistakable. Martha Prescott standing next to a group of powerful figures from the city's past. His heart raced. This woman, this seemingly frail elderly lady, was at the center of a web of corruption that stretched back decades. The phone rang, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Marcus, his lawyer. David, we need to talk. There's been a development. David listened in stunned silence as Marcus explained the latest findings. There were connections between Kyle's adoption, the town's political elite, and a conspiracy that had led to the death of their mother. It was all starting to make sense now, the missing pieces of his past falling into place. When Marcus finished, David hung up, his hands shaking. His mother hadn't just died. She had been silenced, just like the mysterious caller had hinted. And Kyle wasn't just a corrupt cop. He was part of the same broken legacy, and somehow they were connected. As David stared at the photograph again, his thoughts swirled with anger, confusion, and disbelief. He needed answers, and there was only one person who could give them to him. Kyle sat in his living room, the silence stretching thick and suffocating. The DNA test kit lay open on the table in front of him, its sterile contents waiting for him to take the next step. He hadn't slept since his conversation with Martha, and now his mind raced with the implications of what she had said. His thoughts kept returning to one central, impossible idea. David Langston, the man he had assaulted, was his brother. With a shaking hand, Kyle swabbed the inside of his cheek, sealing the test in the sterile bag. It felt surreal, like a step into an alternate reality he hadn't signed up for. His entire life, everything he thought he knew, was unraveling. How could he reconcile the man he had been raised to be with the truth about his real family? He placed the swab in the pre-label box and set it aside, ready to be mailed. But waiting was going to be excruciating. His mind was already spinning with every possible scenario, none of them good. If the results confirmed what Martha had said, his life would be shattered beyond recognition. Kyle stood and moved to the window, staring out into the quiet street. The weight of his past, his actions, and the potential truth loomed like a shadow, threatening to swallow him whole. He couldn't sit still. He needed answers now. Across town, David Langston sat hunched over his desk in the community center, his focus deep in the mountain of documents he'd dug up over the past few days. His heart pounded in his chest as he sifted through old police reports, adoption records, and legal documents tied to the Prescott family. But the deeper he dug, the more disturbed he became. The pieces started to fall into place. The strange gaps in Kyle's childhood, the connections between the Prescott family and local elites, and, most shockingly, David's own connection to the entire web of corruption that stretched through their town's history. It was all leading to one horrifying conclusion. He and Kyle were brothers, separated by a past neither of them fully understood. David leaned back in his chair, a cold wave of realization washing over him. His breath came out in shallow, ragged gasps. How could this be possible? How could the man who had brutalized him on the side of the road be the same person tied to his own bloodline? He closed his eyes, the weight of the discovery crushing him. He had fought against people like Kyle his entire life, against the very system that Kyle represented. And now, it seemed they shared more than just a violent encounter. They shared a past. Pushing himself up from the desk, David knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. He grabbed his phone and dialed his lawyer, Marcus. His voice was barely steady as he explained what he had uncovered. The line was quiet for a moment before Marcus sighed, his voice low and cautious. David, if this is true, it complicates things. Legally, emotionally, everything. David clenched his jaw. I know, but I need to talk to him. I need to know if he knows the truth. Marcus hesitated. Be careful, David. This isn't just about exposing him anymore. This is personal. David hung up, his mind racing. It was more than personal now. It was family. A few days later, Kyle stood at his front door, staring down at the small, innocuous envelope in his hands. His palms were sweaty, his heart hammering in his chest. The DNA results had arrived, and with them, the truth that could tear his world apart. He walked back into the living room and sank into the couch, staring at the envelope for what felt like hours. His mind was screaming at him not to open it, to leave the truth buried where it belonged. But he couldn't. He needed to know. With shaking hands, he tore the envelope open, his breath catching in his throat as he unfolded the letter. The words blurred together for a moment, but when his eyes finally focused, there it was, in black and white. 99.9% probability of a sibling match between Kyle Prescott and David Langston. Kyle's entire body went numb. His chest felt tight, his mind racing as he read the words again and again, trying to make sense of it. He hadn't just assaulted a man. He had assaulted his own brother. He threw the paper down, his hands running through his hair as the weight of his actions crashed down on him. All the years of enforcing the law, of standing by his principles, of believing he was in the right. It was all a lie. How could he ever reconcile the man he had become with the family he never knew he had? The realization that he had been living in the shadow of lies and corruption, upheld by the very people who had torn his family apart, was too much to bear. David had spent days preparing himself for this moment. He stood outside Kyle's house, his fists clenched at his sides, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Every instinct in him screamed to turn around, to walk away, but the pull of the truth was too strong. He knocked on the door, and after a few moments, Kyle answered, his face pale, his expression conflicted. The tension between them was palpable, both men knowing that this conversation would change everything. Kyle, David said, his voice tight, we need to talk. Kyle stepped aside, letting him in. They stood in the living room, neither willing to sit, as the silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. David finally broke the silence, his words sharp and direct. Did you know? Did you know we were brothers? Kyle swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't, not until recently. Martha told me, and then I took the DNA test. It confirmed everything. David's hands clenched into fists at his sides. And now what? What do we do with this? How am I supposed to reconcile everything that's happened? Kyle's gaze fell to the floor. I don't know. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it myself. David took a step forward, his anger boiling over. You beat me, Kyle. You humiliated me in front of the entire town. You represent everything I've been fighting against my whole life. And now, you're telling me that you're my brother? Kyle's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He couldn't. There was nothing he could say that would undo the damage he had caused. The room was thick with tension, the weight of their shared past pressing down on them both. David's eyes burned with anger and betrayal, but beneath it all, there was something else, something that neither of them had expected. A flicker of recognition, of the blood that tied them together. I don't know how to make this right, Kyle said, his voice raw with guilt. But I want to try. I didn't know, David. I didn't know we were connected like this. David's eyes narrowed, his voice barely a whisper. I can't just forget what happened, but I need to know the truth about our family, about why we were separated. Kyle nodded, his voice heavy with resignation. We'll find the answers together. But I know one thing for sure. Our mother didn't just disappear. She was silenced, and the people who did it are still out there. David stared at him for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. The anger and betrayal still burned hot, but for the first time, there was a sliver of hope. The hope that they could uncover the truth and maybe, just maybe, find some semblance of peace.